So now let's discuss this from a range of perspectives with NeighborWorks CEO Marietta Rodriguez, Doug Bibby from the National Multifamily Housing Council, Diane Yentl from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and Stockton Williams of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Thank you all for joining us and for your leadership and collaboration on this urgent priority. Marietta?
Thank you, David. As Jean noted earlier, the emergency rental assistance programs really passed and stood up within the last 12 months, which is incredible. In addition, I would just note that the emergency rental assistance funding in the American Rescue Plan, the package of the American Rescue Plan also directed NeighborWorks to stand up a new $100 million housing stability counseling program, which provided grants to support housing counseling for people at risk of losing their homes through eviction or foreclosure, which is a lesson that we learned from the Great Recession of 2008. As we look back on this extraordinary year, we must acknowledge it was and is a historic moment. Recognizing the need, Congress historically proportioned action by providing funds to fill this gap. And as we've heard, they did it twice. And though we've stemmed the growing eviction crisis for years, at this moment, the nation coalesced to keep millions of households from the brink of homelessness through these unprecedented investments. So what have been the challenges? What have been the opportunities? Will these partnerships and relationships endure? How has equity played a role in the program development? Here to explore these lessons and issues and more is our incredible panel. Joining me is Diane Yentl, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, where she works to achieve socially and just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable, decent homes. We have Doug Bibby. Mr. Bibby is the president of the National Multifamily Housing Council, where he leads the organization representing its members on Capitol Hill and advocates for rental housing. And Stockton Williams. Mr. Williams is the executive director of the National Council on State Housing Agencies, where he leads the council's wide-ranging efforts to advocate and strengthen in the nation's housing system. So let me just start with a general question to all of my panelists. I'll go Stockton, Diane, and then Doug. From your perspective in the industry, what was one challenge and one opportunity you saw with the emergency rental program? So we'll start with Stockton.
Well, thanks, Marietta. It's a joy to be with you all and at this historic NHC conference. Congrats to the conference for 90 years. I agree with the sentiments in the video that the last year has been one of the most impactful that the conference has had. I also want to thank Eileen Fitzgerald for Wells Fargo Foundation's support, not just for NHC, but for many organizations, including NCSHA and what we're trying to do. When I talk about this subject, as I do from time to time, I always like to introduce myself to those who may not know the state housing finance agencies by saying that about 70% of the emergency rental assistance funding is being administered by an entity of government that's not a state HFA. But the state HFAs are running about 30%. And I think where they have succeeded, where they have struggled, where they're continuing to try to improve, does give a good window into the program administration issues that are happening at all levels of government. So I would say, if Jean hadn't said it, the biggest challenge, of course, was the startup, the creation of the new national infrastructure. But since Jean got to say that, I would add that a particular challenge that continues is that we know now more than we ever did that so much of the nation's rental stock, so much of the affordable rental housing is in very small properties operated by non-institutional or so-called mom and pop owners, which in general aren't members of the National Multi-Housing Council, aren't in existing relationships with state housing finance agencies, may not even be registered in the few states and cities that have landlord registries. And as the crisis has gone on, as emergency rental assistance has begun to flow more efficiently, I think where we see the remaining challenge is getting the resources to the smaller properties, the smaller owners who in particular are likely serving the people who have the most acute needs. In terms of opportunity, Marietta, I think it's to something Jean said. When emergency rental assistance was created, we were mainly focused on paying back rent and utilities. That's what's explicitly referenced in the statute. That, of course, is a predicate to doing more to stabilize the most vulnerable renters. Now, what many housing finance agencies have learned, and what I think the administration has framed very effectively, is we can think about a more humane system to limit evictions and to provide a more enduring safety net for low-income renters that includes emergency rental assistance, but isn't limited to that. Also includes other supports to community-based organizations and renters themselves. So that's the work ahead with the emergency rental assistance program, and where I think we see an opportunity.
Thank you. Diane.
Sure. Hi, Marietta, and thanks to the National Housing Conference for the opportunity to be here today to talk about this really important topic. I would say the greatest challenge has been and continues to be the slow rate of spending by many states and cities. You know, we are 10 months after the money was allocated to jurisdictions, and we're nearly a year after it was appropriated. And yet over half of all states have spent less than a third of their funds, despite really significant remaining needs in many of those areas. And I just have to respond directly to Jean, as I've done many times privately to him, that, you know, however long Congress gave communities to spend this money, we all know that it was appropriated to respond to an emergency, not to respond to housing needs over the next 4 years. And I think it doesn't help any of us if we suggest that funds. Now, there's been many reasons for slow spending. You know, some communities were slowed down by state legislatures or city councils. A handful of states received more ERA than they need due to Congress's faulty allocation formula that only considered population and not actual need or number of renters. Some ERA administrators continue to struggle with landlords who don't want to participate in the programs. But the primary challenge with slow ERA spending has been that many programs aren't following the really clear Treasury and White House guidance, aren't embedding best practices into their programs. And Jean and the White House certainly have been very responsive to the challenges and obstacles and have put out very clear directive on how to utilize best practices, and yet a high number of communities are not. There have been improvements in some communities, and you know, some have done it really well from the start, but this slow processing of applications, slowly getting the money out, continues to be a major challenge of the program. And just to say too, that this of course is not, we all know this is not an academic exercise, right? Or about half of the 6 million renter households who are behind on rent live in communities where there are state or local protections for them against evictions. But about half of them live in communities where there's slow rates of spending ERA, there's high need, and there are no protections in place for renters. So, for example, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Louisiana, in these and other communities, eviction filings are increasing. And in some cases, they are surpassing historic levels. And clearly, it's unacceptable for there to be any eviction for non-payment of rent when there are abundant resources to keep renters housed that just hasn't reached them yet. As for the opportunities, you know, the main opportunity with ERA, I think, is obvious. First and foremost, to keep renters who fell behind on their rent during a global pandemic stably housed, and to ensure that those small landlords get the rental income that they need to maintain and operate their properties. But we also have the opportunity to really ensure that these hard-fought lessons learned, this critical infrastructure that we've built, remains and receives permanent funding. So even before the pandemic, we were working towards a permanent emergency rental assistance program, and we had bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate to achieve it. You know, at that time, pre-2020, we were envisioning the creation of a pilot program. I'd say 2020 and 2021 have been our pilot, and we'll now work to enact a permanent program that can utilize this infrastructure that has been built over the last year and a half.
Thank you. Doug, what about your perspective, challenge and opportunity?
Well, let me flip it, because Stockton and Diane started with the challenge. I'll start with the opportunity. I think the opportunity is is that we recognize that by the way, there are three pieces of legislation that are really important here. The CARES Act, let's not forget what that did. That was probably their best performance because it put money in the hands of households and really set the stage for an understanding of how best to mitigate the evictions is to put money in households' hands. And I think the CARES Act was the ground that we needed to build upon. And then I think the two pieces of legislation were a recognition that if you get that money out to the landlords and to the residents, that you can mitigate these difficulties. So, but Stockton and I have talked about this too. I mean, it's wonderful that Congress 3 times through the CARES Act and these two pieces of legislation got it right, partially. A lot right with the CARES Act, not so much right with the administration of the ERAP. And it's a failure to understand how, as Stockton had said, how fragmented rental housing is, and how many of these owners are smaller and don't even know the program exists. And then coupled with that, you distribute the funds, and particularly in California and New York, to general funds, not to those agencies of government who are used to and proficient in distributing aid to households. So you immediately create a problem for yourself right there. And so, and then you compound that with 25 to 30 page documents only in English. Hello. And so you're creating problem after problem after problem that you have to dig out of. And I appreciate Gene's, being self-effacing about this to a certain extent. But we have so much to dig out of to get this right. And to Diane's point, it's shameful that so little of the funding has still made its way to the households who really need it. We do need a safety net, and this is one way to provide that. But you get it right conceptually, and then practically you don't get it right. So that's my perspective.
That's really helpful. I want to probe something that you've mentioned here and ask both you and Diane to react. I think one of the things that we hear from the NeighborWorks Network a lot is about just the confusion about how to access resources, or maybe people not even knowing, both landlords and renters, that these resources are available and how to access them. We learned in the 2008 foreclosure crisis that people in crisis, whether it's a health crisis, an economic crisis, or both, they're dealing with their crisis and then trying to figure out who has this money, do I qualify, how do I figure that out, is a really high bar. So I think one of the issues nuances, not really nuance, but issues that you raise is really about outreach and marketing and awareness. So I'll start with you, Diane, and then go to Doug. What could we do better in terms of outreach and marketing of these programs so we can get higher utilization?
Sure, it's a really good question and an important point, and I think you lay out some of the challenges really well. Reaching communities who have the greatest needs can be challenging at any time, and especially during a pandemic. Language barriers, mistrust of government programs, inadequate access to technology, all barriers to reaching the lowest income people. And I will say too that from early on, we were not urging communities to move very fast very early, because we knew that designing and administering programs that meet the needs of the lowest income people in some of the most marginalized communities takes time. And some places did take that time to design the kind of programs that have really robust and equitable outreach and various ways to apply that led to more success for the program. So, some of the best practices that we've seen in programs throughout the country include working with the community-based partners, organizations that are in those communities, employed by people who live in those communities, who know where the greatest needs are and who have the trust of the community. So when they knock on a door, somebody will answer it and they can get the kind of assistance they need to apply. Providing, to Doug's point, providing marketing and outreach and application materials through multiple methods. So door knocking, pop-up clinics, community events, social media, in multiple languages, certainly in languages that are appropriate for the community, and in ways that are accessible to people with disabilities will all increase uptake. There's also a best practice that we've seen implemented in some community is distributing the program information or doing intake at key points of intervention where you're likely to meet the people who have the greatest needs. So courts, libraries, food pantries, homeless shelters, public transportation systems, vaccination sites is a great place to be doing outreach. And we've seen some communities do that. And then I would just say too that the best practice to get the lowest income people able to receive the resources they need is to have simple programs to ensure that the documentation is very limited and utilize self-attestation. That's because some of the documentation requirements in some programs are so burdensome that some of the most marginalized renters literally can't produce the documentation that's required of them. So that simplification is essential, and being transparent and really clear in all of the outreach materials about what that person needs to show and needs to do is also going to help increase uptake.
That's great. I would add to your list in intervention spots. Certainly housing counseling agencies all across the country provide another outlet. Doug, what are you hearing from your membership about strategies that have been effective at reaching this population?
Well, we don't have as many problems because my members are typically almost exclusively, but not totally, in the market rate arena, and much more sophisticated, software programs and packages that they can use and so on. But I think, we're all sitting here being critical, but if you had said to me, Congress is going to pass over $46 billion of assistance for households and for landlords, I would have fallen off my stool. It is unprecedented in what they did. Now, I think if we're going to talk about lessons learned here and what we might learn for the future, it is understanding your audience, understanding how to reach that audience, understanding how to create a program that can be run, as I said earlier, through the agencies that are typically used to administering that aid to households, and making sure that materials are provided that are at least bilingual, that are, to Diane's point, much simpler. These 25 and 30 page things, and with people who have no access to Wi-Fi, they're also cut out of this. So it is really understanding how to create a program. It's not enough to have the money passed. It is how do you get it out there efficiently? But will take one issue with Gene Sperling is, and to Diane's earlier point, we can't wait till 2025. This is emergency funding, and some of those households, if we don't help them now, are going to fall through the cracks, and that's really tragic. And so, I'm not saying anything that already hasn't been said, but I just, it's remarkable that this money was enacted. I wish we could go back and recreate the strategy, understand what community-based organizations to work through to get those funds and to make awareness in those minority communities in particular, where there are language difficulties.
Right.
So, I'm sorry, it does frustrate the heck out of me, and it frustrates the heck out of Stockton and then Diane too, that we're sitting here still trying to piece this together.
No, a lot of us. Stockton, I want to ask you what you may be hearing from state housing finance agencies who may not be always in the front line of service delivery, who may be put in that place of reaching out to people in need. Were there lessons learned? Are there strategies that you can share what's happening at the local level?
Yeah, I very much appreciate the question because obviously state housing finance agencies had not historically been in the business of providing direct to consumer assistance really for anything. Even the HFAs that do run housing choice vouchers, that's a very well established long running program. And so this was a new exercise. And I think that point has been made. In terms of what works, I mean, we've learned a lot from the National Low Income Housing Coalition and their state Low Income Housing Coalition members, and all of the practices that Diane outlined, I think, are being pretty widely deployed. The real challenge, I think, with respect to community-based outreach, trusted institutions, and these kinds of concepts is, of course, they sort of presume a much wider spread and deeper capacity exists to deliver it than in fact does. And really where I think the state programs get the most frustrated is when they see sort of these facile comparisons and spend out between state and local programs. In most places where there are entitlement jurisdictions, meaning cities and counties that got significant amounts of their own ERA money, the state program said, we're not going to operate there. We're going to try to actually stay out of the way of landlords and renters who need access so we have a little less confusion. We're going to focus on the most far-flung rural or ex-urban areas. Obviously, those are the hardest to serve, both from the perspective of the program, but also they don't have typically, and there are of course many exceptions, the type of community-based delivery system and infrastructure. Last thing I'd say is, there's some limitations in the statute. Again, when this all started a year and a half or so ago, the focus was heavily on, paying back rent and utilities. Congress, I think, to their credit, did provide the ability for the programs on the ground to use some of the money for housing stability services, as the term is called. And it's really from that small slice that state and local programs have been able to do some of the community engagement, eviction diversion, other types of critical interventions. I wonder if we had to do it all over again, whether a lot of us wouldn't have advocated maybe for the share of dollars to be more for some of the kinds of approaches that you all are talking about, and maybe actually a little less if it was a zero-sum game for the unpaid rent and utilities, because clearly there is a lot of leverage in getting to the most vulnerable renters when you go through trusted community-based institutions. And so I think that's another area where, again, to look at it at least partly positively, we've got more ERA dollars to spend. We've got more partnerships being formed every day. We can continue to learn where there are capacity gaps that need to get filled in.
That's interesting. So let me just be clear. So what you're saying is in areas that didn't have strong infrastructure, maybe more of the money could be used to stand up an infrastructure or support a delivery system that may not previously exist.
Yeah, I think we believe, which I think all of us do, and probably many on the call, that community-based organizations, advocates, legal aid attorneys, and others are really playing a critical role here. Those organizations need to be funded, but they also need to exist. And I think Jean had highlighted, promising eviction diversion practices that White House has identified in 31 states. That's probably a lot more than there were 6-9 months ago. It's not 50. And there's a lot more that needs to get built out in terms of this overall infrastructure to protect renters.
I think the infrastructure question is an issue that we should focus on a little bit if we are all sort of playing a little bit of a Monday morning quarterback on this. And that can be luxurious, but I think there are lessons to be learned here for the next crisis. I guess I'd be interested in talking about this infrastructure. How could we, as a country, maintain an infrastructure in between these crises so that we're not rebuilding and ramping up each time? That could be very expensive, but at the same time, it's expensive not to. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. I'll start with Diane. I'll go to Stockton, then Doug.
Sure. A few thoughts on that. One, in terms of lessons learned and looking back at what could have been done differently, I think it's important too to remember that the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, as initially designed, was meant to help low-income renters stay current on their rent during the pandemic. And Congress was so late to enact the funds that they then had to be used to help all the renters who fell behind to catch up. That's a very different program And it's not how the program was envisioned or frankly designed. And also that there were, early on, we were strongly urging that the program be administered by HUD. It ended up going through the Department of Treasury, ironically, because people thought that the money would get out faster that way. But I do think, relying on the federal agency that has the skill, the expertise, the people, the infrastructure to not only meet the housing needs of people, but to work day in and day out with the lowest income people in the most marginalized communities would be better moving forward. I think one of the biggest lessons, frankly, that we learned here that Doug mentioned briefly early on is that cash in people's pockets is the most efficient and effective way to assist the lowest income people. The one time where we saw in the data the biggest drop in the number of renters behind on rent was after they received their stimulus checks. So, the evidence is very clear that when low income people get cash, the vast majority of it use it to pay their bills and meet essential needs like housing. But certainly we also learned many lessons about how to design and implement and administer emergency rental assistance programs, some of which we've already touched on, lessons like doing that robust and equitable outreach, simplifying applications, using self-attestation, using direct-to-tenant assistance. But the larger issue here, of course, is that emergency housing resources, as historic and unprecedented as they were only ever meant to create some level of housing stability during the pandemic. They do nothing to address the underlying housing shortage and crisis that existed pre-pandemic, will continue to exist post-pandemic unless and until Congress actually provides the resources that are needed to keep the lowest income people safely, stably, affordably housed. And long-term solutions like Section 8, like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, if we had had a universal voucher program in place prior to the pandemic, that's the program that would have expanded and absorbed the new need during this disaster or other disasters. And we all would have been better off for it.
Thank you. I'm going to get back to a couple of things you mentioned, but let me ask Stockton that same question about an infrastructure and keeping it at some level so that we're not rebuilding it for every crisis.
Yeah, look, state housing finance agencies exist to administer programs and provide financing. I think there's a part of this problem, this continuing problem that will outlast the pandemic, maybe a big part of it that is beyond the reach of a program and ought to be best served by what we did, that Doug reminded us that we did, $800 billion in stimulus checks, hundreds of billions of dollars in unemployment insurance, $50 billion in child care plus a child care tax credit. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities put out a report the other day that said of the families that have used the child tax credit, 45% of them have used just that program to pay their housing costs. It's highly likely that these kinds of direct assistance payments are the most effective way to get to people who have language barriers, who can't get online, who maybe live in a far-flung location, an adversarial relationship with their landlord. State and county and local programs are doing terrifically well in many cases and will always have a critical role to play. But if we really want to create a safety net for renters, it probably ought to look like and be part of the safety net that already exists for nutrition and childcare, and will hopefully be built out more in the Build Back Better Act. That is going to be more efficient, ultimately, at getting to the most vulnerable, because there are limits ultimately to any program, whatever level of government you're running it at, whatever the agency in charge is, whatever the political makeup of that community, there are going to be limits to programs if the threshold has to be universal availability to people who are in dire crisis.
Doug, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think a couple. One is that when they do the postmortem on this, to Diane's point, think about the overall administrator of this, and think about actually going back and recreating a network to communicate. We have increasingly by day diverse population, and we have to use all the means to communicate with those populations where they are in their languages through the community organizations that can best reach them. And I would urge the postmortem to say, listen, the next time out, and there's going to be a next time out. This is the way that we should structure it. These are the resources that should be part of that overall plan. You know, a NeighborWorks and the HFAs and all would be part of this, you know, going forward. Two things that, one that Diane mentioned and one that Stockton mentioned. We have been advocating along with both of their organizations. You know, we've been advocating for a doubling of the funding for the Section 8 program. We need to get more vouchers in the hands of people. We would even say a tripling of the funding for the low-income housing tax credit program to build more housing. It's a pimple on the budget. You know, it's so small, it's ridiculous. So I think that goes back to the issue of the safety net. We've got to expand the safety net, and then we've got to have a mechanism put in place that can be efficient and by that and effective. And I mean both efficient and effective.
Diane, I want to get back to something that you noted, and it was in Doug's comments just now. And it's my question is, you're right. This is unprecedented allocation appropriation to an emergency crisis, right? But we still need to, it's just a short-term solution. We have bigger long-term issues we're trying to solve in terms of supply and that safety net. So my question is, it's pretty amazing that Congress acted so quickly with this allocation, but how do we align long-term housing needs and investment that's needed on the back of this crisis? How do we align sort of those messages so that we don't waste this crisis and we can move the ball further down the field on our long-term needs?
Yeah, well, we have an extraordinary opportunity in front of us with the Build Back Better Act, you know, which all of us on this panel and most of us on this call have been working very hard over the last many years in many ways, but certainly over the last several months to ensure is really robust investments in affordable housing. Our focus at the National Income Housing Coalition, as always, is ensuring that whatever resources are provided for housing through the Build Back Better Act are deeply targeted towards those with the greatest needs, the lowest income renters, and people experiencing homelessness. So the $150 billion of direct allocations that's currently in the Build Back Better Act is deeply targeted. 70% of those funds would go towards repairing or creating new housing opportunities for extremely low income people and people experiencing homelessness. This is how we start to rebuild and expand the housing social safety net. So the investments in that legislation include $65 billion for public housing repair and preservation, which would make nearly 1 million affordable homes that predominantly house people of color and very low income people of color to be decent quality accessible homes. This would be the largest infusion of public housing capital repair dollars in the program's history. The voucher program, which we've already talked about, $25 billion in rental assistance, which is in the Build Back Better Act, would provide over 300,000 new housing choice vouchers. They're all targeted to extremely low income renters, and about a quarter of those funds, actually a little bit more, are targeted to people experiencing homelessness. It's the largest expansion of Section 8 since the program's inception in 1974. And the bill includes $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, which would build or preserve about 150,000 homes affordable to the lowest income people, also the largest funding allocation in the program's history. Altogether, it is without a doubt the largest, most significant federal investment in housing for the country's lowest income renters and people who are homeless in our country's history. So I think it's an extraordinary and unique moment for so many reasons. But maybe the biggest relevant to this conversation is the fact that we are leaving this pandemic, hopefully, having this conversation about how to get these already unprecedented funds out to the tenants who need it, while we're also have, within our grasp, the possibility of an even greater scale of unprecedented resources to start to address the long-term permanent solutions that are needed.
So Marietta, could I go just the comment here? You
Sure,
asked,
I was gonna throw it to both you and Stockton and ask you, like, what would incentivize your membership in developing more affordable units? So if you can use your comment and then pivot to.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, let me start with, I'll address that, but I think we need to start with all of us speaking forcefully to policymakers that our housing system, our housing finance system is broken. And it is not a fault of the Democrats or the Republicans. It's the fault of both parties over 30 years plus of not addressing the issues, both on the demand side and through the Section 8 program and other safety net programs, but also on the supply side. We're not producing enough affordable housing, and there are myriad issues surrounding that, whether it's regulation, it's land costs, it's a lot of issues at the local level. Exclusionary zoning, NIMBYism is just running rampant across our society. I think we ought to, our message to policymakers is if Build Back Better gets passed, if it doesn't get passed, we still ought to be talking about how do we fix the system so that on the demand side, we're doing what's right, and on the supply side, we're doing what's right. The pandemic has taken away more affordable units through the lack of some of these owners to hang on to those properties, and they're lost now.
That's right.
So I'm not sure that addresses your question, but I wanted to say that, we need to acknowledge that our system is broken. And a little Band-Aid here and a Band-Aid there is not going to work, which is why, and Stockton knows that, what we've been working on pre-pandemic, was a holistic plan for policymakers that had these elements in it. And we had all the groups lining up, and then obviously we got sidetracked a little bit, but that's the way I think about it. And am talking about with policymakers. Stockton, over to you.
Yeah, Stockton, what would you say about incentivizing additional affordable development?
Well, this is an easy answer, which doesn't mean it's easy to actually make happen. We know it works to create affordable new multifamily units, low-income housing tax credits, multifamily bond financing, the home program, the housing trust fund, some of these very, very well-established, proven programs that, as Diane mentioned, are poised to be expanded if Build Back Better passes. Obviously, we should also be investing in the rehabilitation of precious public housing and existing HUD subsidized affordable units as well. I think I'd just add that we shouldn't lose sight of the homeownership equation here. One of the reasons that rent is so out of reach for so many people is because there are not enough starter homes for lower income people who could, under normal market conditions, afford to buy one available anywhere. Freddie Mac says that, the number of new entry-level homes is now something like 50,000 a year. A decade ago, it was 400, 500,000 a year. So Build Back Better also has a tax credit that would spur the development and rehab of new affordable for-sale homes. It's a relatively small program because that was all that could be included for the budget constraints, but it could be a down payment on a bigger expansion. So clearly we need to put most of the production resources into affordable rental, but we also need to make sure we're producing more affordable for-sale homes. So some of those renters who are ready to buy don't take up units that would be better serving people who could only rent as their option at the moment.
And I do think there's a panel right after us that's going to tackle or focus on homeownership. I want to go back to something that Jean spent a lot of time on, and I think we should probably discuss a little bit here, and that is the window of opportunity for reallocation. And if we were in charge of the entire pool, what recommendations, based on our experience, based on the discussion that we had here, want to see the administration think through when we look at reallocation and what's allowed in the legislation? So Diane, I'll start with you. I'll go to Doug and I'll land with Stockton, but it just seemed like there's an opportunity there. Diane?
Sure, yeah, it's definitely an opportunity and a challenge, I think, as if we need more in the ERA program. But because we have about 30% of all grantees having spent less than 30% of their ERA one, their first ERA allocation, they're at risk of losing funds through reallocation. And that's about 63% of the state grantees are at risk of losing some of their funds, and about 25% of the local grantees are in that same position. So altogether, Treasury could recapture about $1.2 billion. It may be as little as 300 million, depending on how those slow or low spending states do their performance improvement plans. But there will certainly be some reallocation. And certainly there's some places that have more emergency rental assistance than needed, again, because of the faulty allocation formula that didn't take into consideration number of renters, number of struggling renters, number of renters behind on rent. So for example, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, they likely have more than they need. And there's other places that have much more need than they have ERA funding to meet, like New York, New Jersey, Texas, California. So some of the recapture reallocation, I think, can happen relatively easily, but in other places it's going to be more complicated. So we have been re-urging that the recapture reallocation process follow 3 guiding principles. One, that funds are only reallocated to grantees that are utilizing best practices and that are quickly getting assistance to households in need. In other words, that have already proven success with the program. 2, that funds be reallocated to jurisdictions that have high levels of need, as measured by the number of low-income renters, the number of people experiencing homelessness. And then 3rd, we have really been hammering, as Jean mentioned early on, that all renters in need should still have access to ERA funding across all jurisdictions. So in other words, renters have to be held harmless for their slow spending ERA programs and still be able to receive needed help as the funds are reallocated. And then just to quickly also mention that in the meantime, as the recapture reallocation process happens, those slow spending grantees should continue improving, should look to best practices, embed them in their programs, get the money out faster. Those low spending grantees too could look to redistribute or transfer funds within their own state to improve spending and reach some of the areas with the highest needs. And also that those low spending programs should look to expend their assistance to serve households experiencing homelessness, which is clearly an eligible use of those funds, and increase the duration of the assistance that's provided to households to ensure longer term housing stability for them.
I'm wondering if there are ways in which to combine or understand what the challenges are in the places of low spend and see if there are commonalities and ways in which technical assistance can be delivered in a really targeted way. I don't know that there's the ability to do that, but it seems like that's potentially an opportunity.
Well, there is. Yes, I mean, there's generally speaking, there's 2 buckets of challenges with the slow spending grantees. One is that handful of states that received more money than the need exists in their communities. The other are the grantees who are not using best practices. There are still, a surprising and extraordinarily frustrating number of grantees who still have these overly complicated applications, who still require burdensome documentation. That slows down the process for everyone.
Absolutely. I saw Stockton, you went off mute. Were you trying to?
Oh, yeah, I didn't know if I was next, Merit. I'd just like to make 2 points. I mean, number one, I have no doubt that if Congress had put HUD in charge of this program, the team there under Secretary Fudge would have done an excellent job from the federal perspective in overseeing the emergency rental assistance program. I want to say, though, that from the standpoint of not just the states, but counties and localities, because we've convened all of them in a lot of engagement with the administration, we think the Treasury Department has been remarkable. And trust me, they haven't accepted every recommendation that we have made. They've pushed back hard. At times, there has been rhetoric that I think we have found to be problematic. But in general, the team there has been highly responsive. And what you've seen in terms of a highly iterative, evolving policy framework for this program is extremely unusual, arguably unprecedented. If you look at what the federal rules for ERA were in March, when this administration published the first set of them, and what they are now, they have been directly responsive to what Doug's members and Diane's members and housing finance agencies and county and local agencies have suggested. Again, they haven't given us everything that any of us have asked for, but I do think Treasury should be commended. And that gets to my second point on reallocation. We'll see how much is actually reallocated. As Jean said, we've done some work internally, and no one will be surprised that we have no plans to publish it, that suggest, based on a much more sophisticated analytic approach than Congress was able to use, that the funding formula resulted in many more than a handful of states getting more money than they need to this point in time. And as we go through reallocation, I do hope that the states that were thrown under the bus by the media and some elected officials will get a second look, because so-called poor performers are going to look different when their need is right-sized. That's my prediction and my hope. But remember, we are talking about a going forward program. And so the key states and localities would be the ones who, as Diane mentioned, are sort of, in the middle of the pack, maybe even towards the back in terms of how much they've spent so far. But if they can demonstrate to Treasury that, hey, we're doing better, we're adopting more of the recommended practices, we have need out there, as Diane mentioned, all we've really been able to do is start making it down on what was owed, what has been owed. But if jurisdictions can start to show progress in spending, adoption of right practices, and a trajectory over the next year or so for ERA1, we certainly expect that those dollars will remain in those jurisdictions, because that would be the most efficient way to make sure they get out to the people who need them. Let's use, as I think everyone has said, the infrastructure that's been built. Let's get the money out to everyone who's eligible and needs it over the period of time that the funds are available. And I think in most cases, you're going to see Treasury make the determination that after some reallocation and an assessment of remaining need for the next year, this program and the performance will look dramatically different.
This issue of holding tenants harmless, I think is a good one. There's a question that came in the chat, and it mentions NCSHA. So I'm going to direct this to you.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
So slow spending state grantees could benefit from a strike force, maybe deployed by NCSHA or possibly HUD, so that needy tenants are not penalized. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say, hi, Kate. It's great to hear from you. I think there's a lot of peer learning that has continued to go on, and it's not just a closed loop among the program administrators, but also with a lot of input from advocates and landlords and others. And so I think a lot of assistance in sort of adopting better and best practices is happening. In terms of sort of direct technical assistance, that is an area where this program has some funding that is available to the administration. I'm not sure we've seen a lot of that yet. There are undoubtedly some areas where some jurisdictions would benefit from that. I think it's frankly less on the program design at this point and more on the actual acceleration of delivery, processing applications, creating more user-friendly platforms, getting awareness to the communities and the folks who currently just still don't even know that this resource is there for them. If technical assistance could be provided, either federally funded or through some other source in some of those areas, I think there'd be a number of states and counties and localities that would be very eager to receive it.
Let me ask Doug and Diane to answer this question. So having the benefit of this discussion, your experience, what would you do differently if you were starting at the beginning? What are the three things that would be most impactful that you would have done differently in the design, the policy writing, the execution? We'll start with Doug, Diane, and we'll.
All right. Well, I would start with finding the right agency to oversee this. I think to Stockton's point, I want to give some props to Treasury. They have been very responsive. They tried with FAQs and clarifications out there, but HUD would have been a better choice. Number two, I would start before anything with a plan and understand the target audience and how to reach that target audience. And so, I think if you do those two things, you find basically the right administrator, and you have the right plan, then a lot of things will flow. And then the third thing, which goes back to the allocation issue, is, it's like having two senators from North Dakota and two senators from New York or California. It's what was designed for us, but in some ways, that the allocation that took place was just out of whack with reality. We had a need out there in some of these states with huge populations and huge renter populations, and other states that not so. So I would those are the three things I would think about.
Diane, three things.
I would agree with all those. I would say allocate the money sooner when the need became first very clear and evident. The House of Representatives enacted emergency rental assistance in June of 2020, but it wasn't until December that the money was enacted. When the House passed, did I say enacted? When the House passed that legislation, renters by and large were still current on their rent. So that money could have helped renters stay current rather than falling so far behind on rent and playing a game of catch up. Certainly, I think fully agree that Treasury has done well and that there are extraordinarily committed and talented people working on this program at Treasury, and that this program should be administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development that has the infrastructure, the expertise, and the relationships at federal, state, and local level that would have made this program more successful. I think the White House could have done more in using its platform and its huge voice in terms of the marketing piece and making people aware earlier on, very early on. So I'm talking about both administrations, about the availability of these funds. I think that could have helped with getting the money out faster. And then again, to go back to wishing that program administrators had been more willing to embed clear best practices, proven best practices earlier on. As Doug had mentioned, through the CARES Act, there were more limited resources, but many communities were using them for emergency rental assistance programs. So by December of 2020, we were tracking 600 emergency rental assistance programs using much more limited funds, but we had already learned a lot of lessons about how to get that money quickly to the lowest income renters and landlords in need. We could have embedded those more quickly into the programs and gotten the money out faster.
Stockton, your three?
Wow, this is great. And I get to go last and say that I agree with all of Diane's and Doug's. I would add, as we've talked about during the course of the panel, more of any funding available should be explicitly provided for outreach, engagement, and some of these other sort of housing stability services that really make sure that the resources can get where they're most needed. Number two, as we are doing, and I hope there's discussion of on the next panel with respect to the Homeowner Assistance Fund, next time, the federal government could do a lot to accelerate the adoption of best practices in the application process by promulgating some model or even required forms. And yes, I'm saying that from the National Council of State Housing Agencies. A big part of the issue that Gene alluded to in his conversations with governors and also mayors has been that we've never known exactly what we're shooting for in terms of something that passes muster with the federal government, particularly around this area of self-attestation and making sure there aren't unnecessary barriers to renter participation. If next time a federal agency, maybe it'd be HUD, maybe it'd be Treasury or somebody else, said, here's the application. This is what it looks like. If you want to add to it on the margins or something, you can. That would be an interesting thing to kind of explore. And then third, where we still don't have everything we need, but I think we have probably all we're going to get. If we, as we clearly are, we're now going to be delivering $46 billion largely under a kind of self-attestation or quasi self-attestation framework, there does need to be some sort of safe harbor or provision that protects the hardworking public housing authorities, county agencies, states, and others who will make bad payments in good faith because there's an error or there's a scammer or whatever reason. There's a way to do that and still maintain high standards of accountability. The coalition and NMHC and all of us have testified to this. Chairman Waters, is the architect of the program in Congress, agrees it would be a good idea. So I think that would be the third one I would add. Let's give a little breathing room since we're really expecting public agencies at all levels of government to do something that is highly unusual, which is to really, have very little, if any, of the typical kinds of documentation requirements you would have for public funds.
Those are all great. I would just, if I can, as moderator, just add, I think one of the lessons that we learned in the foreclosure crisis is the real value of bringing local groups, nonprofits, government, all together around a table to real-time collaborations and lessons learned. And I think all of our moves forward could be really enriched by sharing those experiences, much like we're doing here. So we could spend another hour dissecting this and talking about lessons learned, but we're out of time. So I just want to genuinely thank all of our panelists for participating in this important discussion and offering your thoughts. We have a second panel coming up discussing the Homeowners Assistance Fund, and it will be moderated by Naya Hope from JP Morgan Chase. And so I am tossing the baton to her. Thank you, Stockton, Doug, and Diane for joining me this morning.